I've called it this section here so that you can understand that when the Women's Week magazine says carbon-14 proves the world is millions of years old, it shows that not only are they dummies, they're really dumb dummies. So to show you how it actually works, cosmic rays, high energy rays coming from outer space, in the atmosphere, they will begin to hit atoms, particularly atoms of nitrogen, and they will release neutrons. And what you find is the nitrogen gets converted. It's got 14 particles inside it. So instead of being nitrogen 14, it gets sort of messed up and becomes carbon 14. Radioactive? Well, you see, the interesting principle that God has built into our creation is the principle that everything tends to try to get back to what's normal, to the stable state. So if you've added energy to nitrogen and it bumps a proton and neutron, etc., and everything gets out of place, it will try and get rid of that extra energy and go back to being ordinary carbon. So in the meantime, it becomes radioactive carbon, and the radiation is what's given off for it to try and go back. Okay, the carbon-14, which is very reactive, will react immediately with oxygen, making radioactive carbon dioxide. Enter the green world. Not the greenies of the politics, but the fact is the radioactive CO2 is absorbed by plants. Now, you heard me before. We used to think it was absorbed by all plants evenly, but that simply turns out to be false. But the one thing that is true there is that the plants are eaten by animals. Now, put it in your mind, what's the next problem here? I'm going to dig up an Aboriginal skeleton, I'm going to dig up a wooden boomerang, and I'm going to try and find out how old it is. Well, if I want to date animals or plants, it's true that you eat the animals, and if they've been eating radioactive plants, you now get radioactive. And the trouble is, we don't want to find out when you lived, we want to find out when you die, because the carbon-14 method only works on you when you are dead. Okay, how does this happen? Well, you see, when you're dead, it's a well-known fact that you stop eating, right? So therefore, at that point, at the point of death, the amount of radioactive carbon in you simply can't build up any further. It's leaking radioactivity, and dead people do leak. Lots of things. Radiation is one of them. And here's the simple fact. The longer you are dead, the theory tells us the less carbon-14 you have left. Of course, it assumes you know how much carbon-14 you had. There's all sorts of things around. And when Walter Libby invented a new method of actually trying to find out how long something had been dead, not when it lived, but how long it had been dead. I remember the puns made on Walter Libby's method when I grew up big enough to understand it. Let's rock around the clock tonight. Oh, no, that's Elvis. Let's clock around the rock tonight. That's what they were trying to do. They were trying to invent a new clock, a radioactive timer. And if the radioactive timer actually worked, the way in which we measure it, you should run out of detectable radioactive carbon-14 after about 80,000 years. Issue? All right. If you find an Aboriginal boomerang and you find that the boomerang dates at 70,000 years old by carbon-14, then whoever made it was here 70,000 years ago. You following the logic? But you see, the Bible that the missionaries brought to the Aborigines said there was nobody here 70,000 years ago. There wasn't even any here to be. Okay, Captain Cook arrives in the 1700s, and the biblical account of creation goes back at the most to the Tower of Babel before the Aborigines started to migrate. And in case you think that's sort of just made up to fit the Bible, no, I've been to India. The Aborigines in India have boomerangs. The Aborigines, yes, Aboriginal just means ab-original, the original inhabitants. The Indians, they actually had dingoes. So we got no doubt about it, they came here from somebody else. Diamonds? How did diamonds get into it? Because they're a girl's best friend. And they actually interesting, because if you want to get your girlfriend's diamond ring, you know, the $10,000 one, £5,000 when you bought her, you can actually convert it to carbon-14. Well, you can actually convert it to carbon by burning it. It's a little expensive fire, but you discover that you can date your diamonds with carbon-14. The theory says diamonds are at least 990 million years old, and some are up to 3.2 billion years old. Now, this is pretty old. Hence the logic, diamonds are forever. I think they made a movie called that. But when you find out that carbon-14 exists in diamonds, you have a little problem. Diamonds can be dated by other radioactive schemes because we find uranium lead is actually in those tiny little, they're not holes, but they're inclusions of other materials in the diamonds. But the diamonds are so old, carbon-14 theoretically only lasts until 80,000 years max. So no diamond should have carbon-14 in it. Now, do you see these graphs? No, sorry, these not graphs, but accumulations of data on diamonds. Now, you can go to the carbon-14 journals and get all of these for yourselves. They make interesting reading because there is not only one diamond that's got carbon-14 in it, there's hundreds, and they're all listed in location. And the average percentage of carbon-14 for the 12 diamonds shown is 0.09 plus or minus 0.025 of modern carbon in the diamond itself. Wow. What you find is that this simply tells you that the diamonds weren't here millions of years ago. And the same is true for coal. I've been amazed at, number one, how many coals actually show up with carbon-14 in it. And you might be amazed to find that many coal mines are full of uranium lead as well at the same time. Something's wrong, folks. It's not the facts that are leading people astray here with rejecting the age of the Bible. It's not the evidence that disagrees with the biblical record of creation and Noah's flood. It's actually the mindset, the opinions of men who deliberately and willfully set out to reject and replace the word of God. Now, you know what? It took me a long time to reach that conclusion because I'll be honest, I actually had an attitude. I'll put up one verse to finish off this section with, and then we'll throw it open to questions from Diane or Joseph can take over his section, and then we'll throw it open to questions from everyone. See this verse here? If you believe Moses, you'd believe me, said Jesus, for Moses wrote of me. But since you don't believe what Moses wrote, how will you believe what I say? Now, you remember the statement I made right at the start? Scientists don't care how old a rock is, only how old it isn't. Why? Because they've already rejected the only reliable source, the God who was there, who revealed to Moses what he'd done. Yep, that's what they did. That's what I had troubles with.